Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 25 of What to Think, the technology news podcast from VentureBeat.com. I'm Dylan Tweeney, the editor-in-chief of VentureBeat, and this week I'm joined by Mark Sullivan.
Hello.
Mark is one of our talented staff of reporters, and today Mark and I will be talking to Walter Isaacson, the author of the acclaimed official biography of Steve Jobs. He's just published a new book called The Innovators, which is about the history of digital technology and the digital revolution. We're very excited to speak with him today. But first, here are some tech news highlights from VentureBeat. Let's start with POODLE, Mark.
POODLE. It's an incident that was discovered by security researchers at Google. It's an SSL vulnerability, meaning that it's a vulnerability in the connection between servers at Google and possibly your web browser.
Or any servers using SSL 3.0, correct?
Correct. And there were other players like Mozilla and Microsoft that soon released statements about this security flaw as well in SSL.
Now, this is just the latest in a string of security flaws, right? I mean, we've got Snapchat this week, right? JP Morgan, Home Depot, and then Heartbleed, right? I will say POODLE is a much cuter name for a terrifying flaw than Heartbleed.
Fun fact, POODLE stands for Padding Oracle on Downgraded Legacy.
Okay, that's not exactly illuminating, but that's clever.
Yeah, let's just keep saying POODLE
I
for
think
now.
So.
But yeah, it's interesting because it does seem like the pace at which we're hearing about these kinds of things is accelerating, and the fear is that we are going to get numb to these things as they keep happening. And, these things can potentially cost a lot of money. And, from what I've seen, it's going to continue to accelerate.
What should people think about this, Mark? Is Silicon Valley just headed into chaos of endless security problems? Can we ever get our act together?
Well, I certainly don't know the answer to that question, but just judging on what's been happening over the last few years and the frequency that we're hearing about these things, it certainly doesn't, and also talking to security people when we do these stories, it really doesn't sound like there's a big answer in sight anytime soon.
Well, I will give one bit of practical advice, which is use a different password for every site. Make your passwords random, and the easiest way to do that is to use a service like LastPass or a piece of software like 1Password, which lets you generate completely gibberish passwords and save them so that you can use different ones on every site. That's my advice. Let's move on to some lessons from Y Combinator's startup school. Now, Y Combinator is the influential incubator here in Silicon Valley. Just this past weekend, one of our reporters, Kia Kokolicheva, spent some time on a Saturday at their startup school, which is where they do some training for the startups in the incubator. And they had some big names. Ron Conway gave this bit of advice. You have to learn to hire a management team, and you have to learn how to manage. You have to want success so badly that you learn how to manage, which may be difficult for some entrepreneurs when they're just starting out. Kevin Systrom laid this knowledge on the crew. What people tell you and how they act is very, very different sometimes. He says your friends and early users may say your product is great, but watch how they actually use it or whether they even use it at all. That'll tell you whether or not it's successful.
And I thought it was interesting. Andrew Mason from Groupon was talking about just perceptions that people have as they begin startups, and everybody is thinking about an exit even before they even write any code in some cases. And he points out that after you do go public or get acquired, the visionary process of creating something changes, and you're very accountable from month to month after those sort of exits happen. So I thought that was a nice reality check for the kids.
Yes, be careful what you wish for. Right. You might get it, yes. Here's another great line from Reid Hoffman of Greylock Partners, currently a co-founder of LinkedIn and very influential man about Silicon Valley. One of the myths in Silicon Valley, he said, is the role of government, where we love to hate government here for getting in the way. But he says it is, in fact, what creates the platform environment we operate on. And we'll talk about this later when we talk with Walter Isaacson. Government not only supports a lot of infrastructure around here, it provides a lot of funding that has led to many innovations in Silicon Valley, in the internet, the personal computer industry, and beyond. Tell us about this hipster net neutrality group, Mark.
Yeah, this is an interesting story this week, and it kind of comes in the background, or with the net neutrality debate in the background. There is a group that's called Onward Internet, and they've been going around the country doing street art installations with a big box that says, "Tell us what you want to do with the internet." And these young people are dressed in futuristic costumes, and they look like hipster types, and all very cool. But we find out a little bit later that this group has an interesting backer, and that's Comcast. And Comcast didn't admit to it. And,
double whoops.
Yes. So this is an interesting story. It was actually the NCTA. I'm sorry, not Comcast specifically.
Okay, so National Cable and Telecommunications Association, but Comcast is a backer of the NCTA.
Yeah, the biggest. So yeah, they actually admitted this, and they said that they plan on putting their brand name on this group. And there is, you might wonder why they're doing this. And the only obvious answer is that there is language on this group's site that kind of hints at deregulation and hands off the internet and some rhetoric around that.
They say things like the internet is a wild, free thing, unbounded by limits, unfettered by rules, and so on. That sounds like a libertarian argument or a rallying cry.
You start to see some very clever PR approaches as the FCC comes under more and more pressure to make a ruling on net neutrality. Mm-hmm. So people are getting very, very clever about how they spin this issue. And I think what you're seeing here, and sort of the darker part here, is that some of these groups, their whole thing is to create confusion in the sphere of debate on these issues. And if that state exists, lawmakers are much less likely to act. And so that might be what's at play here. So, on the front of this thing, you have some wacky kids. On the back of this thing, you have something that's very serious.
Big old telco. Yeah, okay, right. So, I have to say, like, the language of not regulating the internet is actually right in line with the net neutrality opponents, or what the cable companies are saying, right? They're saying that regulation will actually have the opposite effect of what net neutrality proponents intend, that the regulation will in fact hurt the market, and if we leave it alone, the market will provide sufficient bandwidth at the right prices for everybody anyway. So I think they're not misrepresenting their actual message, but the way they presented it by putting these street performances out there and not, being upfront about who is backing it, that's really troubling.
I agree. And that's the part that makes you think that they are trying to create confusion. But you're right. Their message is hands off the market, let the market control it. And, and then the debate is there enough competition in the market right now to create the kind of innovation and higher internet speeds that we're looking for?
Well, that's a very good question. All right. For all this and more tech news, you know where to go. VentureBeat.com. We'll look for you there. And now we'd like to thank the host and sponsor of this podcast, New Relic, a software analytics company that makes sense of billions of data points about millions of applications in real time. We are, in fact, recording this podcast in New Relic's fancy, well-appointed studio in downtown San Francisco, and we thank them for that. New Relic's comprehensive SaaS-based software analytics platform empowers developers, ops people, and DevOps people, as well as business leaders, to transform their businesses, all by using real-time data directly from production software. New Relic helps the people who build modern software understand the stories their data is trying to tell them. And now I'd like to welcome our guest, Walter Isaacson. He's the author of the acclaimed official biography of Steve Jobs, which came out in 2011, and he's just published a new book about the history of technology called The Innovators: How a Group of Hackers, Geniuses, and Geeks Created the Digital Revolution. Walter, thank you for joining our show. It's really a pleasure to have you here.
It's my pleasure. Good to talk to you.
Now, you've also written books on Ben Franklin, Albert Einstein, Henry Kissinger, and of course, Steve Jobs. You seem to have a thing about brilliant, somewhat egotistical men. What's this all about?
Well, one of the things I learned, though, in writing biographies is that we biographers kind of distort history a little bit. We make it seem like it's brilliant, egotistical people who, have great visions in their garage or their garret, and then they, create innovations. And one of the things I've learned, in my life at least, and even by watching Steve Jobs, was that it's not just the vision, it's the ability to collaborate and create a team. And when you look at the digital revolution, it was done peer-to-peer. It was done collegially. And I wanted to say, here's a history of the digital revolution, and it's not just about the one or two famous people like Bill Gates you may know.
Right. So, but we love to read about those guys, right? Pro or con. It's sort of exciting, but
right. We love to personalize history, and I do this in the book. I try to make it very personal.
Right.
But there are people that you've heard of, but many of your listeners may not have, like J.C.R. Licklider, who comes up with the notion of interactive computing and what he calls the intergalactic computer network, and it becomes part of the ARPANET and Internet. Or, people like Doug Engelbart and Alan Kay, who are really artistic and connect computers to our, make them more personal. So I wanted to make this biographical. I wanted to make it personal, but I didn't want it to just be a biography of a famous person.
Do you think, could you come down on one side of that equation or the other and say, which is responsible for more lasting innovations, the sort of brilliant individuals, or the kind of faceless big teams like Xerox PARC and IBM and what have you?
No, I think it's got to be some visionaries, but visionaries have to be put into a context where they can execute, because vision without execution is just hallucination. So at Xerox, take Xerox PARC, you have Alan Kay, who is just exuberant and artistic and understands graphical interfaces and why we might want to be childlike and take a personal computer out into the woods and play with them and be creative there. Likewise, Bell Labs, there was a very driven person who was kind of paranoid and racist by the end, Bill Shockley, but you got a team around him in order to invent the computer. That includes an experimentalist like Walter Bratton, a quantum theorist like John Bardeen, but really dozens of other people who turned the vision into reality.
With Jobs, especially, it was part of the energy that sort of spun off this vision that he had that I think energized people around him, right? And helped him.
Absolutely. When I wrote about Steve Jobs, you make him sound like a unique individual visionary. But as soon as I started writing about 1979 to 84, when he creates the Macintosh team and they put a pirate flag above the building,
right,
and he's got this team of 30-some-odd people who are so loyal to him, even though, as you know, Steve Jobs could be a, rather taxing personality. He could be tough on people. But these people, to a person, man and woman, would say, he drove me nuts, he drove me insane, but he drove me to do things I didn't know I was going to be able to do, and I wouldn't have given up the chance in the world to work with him. So it wasn't just that he has a vision for the Macintosh. In fact, the vision was sort of sitting there from other people, and of course Xerox PARC had part of the vision. It was that he made a team of pirates who sat there at the Bandley building in Cupertino, and it was that collegial team that executes on the vision.
Yeah, interesting, but also Jobs was a micromanager, wasn't he?
He was a micromanager about the things he was passionate about, which included hardware design, it included marketing. He did not micromanage, say, software engineering. In fact, famously, he has Steve Wozniak as his partner, who does the hardware engineering for the first circuit board, but also is good at coding. So Steve never looked over people's shoulder and did code. Bill Gates did that. Bill Gates would sit there and look at a piece, some coding somebody would do, and then they'd have a contest to see who could do it in a more compressed form. So all these people, Bill Gates working with Paul Allen, the people at Intel, Bob Noyce, Gordon Moore, Andy Grove. Andy Grove was a very strong micromanager. Bob Noyce was a visionary, but it's like putting together a baseball team. You need utility infielders and pitchers and people who can play all positions.
Right.
Same with Larry and Sergey when they do Google. And the book, that sort of culminates the book when you get Larry and Sergey doing the code for Google, but also having the vision that you combine a computer algorithm with the judgments made by billions of people when they make links on the websites they create, and lo and behold, you tie together both the personal computer and the internet.
I'm very interested in this idea of team building and how some of these traits might spread over some of the various figures in the book. I mean, Larry and Sergey, did you find that was sort of a different type of team building than maybe Jobs or some of the other visionaries in the book?
Yes, but they understand that at a certain point it makes sense to bring in Eric Schmidt. Mm-hmm. Why? Because, they're not buttoned-down managers who know how to deal with the supply chain. One of Steve Jobs' best decisions, 10, 15 years ago, is bring in Tim Cook. Because you say Steve could micromanage, but he didn't micromanage the supply chain or various other
right.
things. So I think if you're brilliant, like Larry and Sergey or Steve Jobs, you say, I need a Tim Cook. Or if you're Bob Noyce, you say, I need an Andy Grove. Or, you say, I need a Sheryl Sandberg if you're Mark Zuckerberg. But you look around and tell me, is there anything being led by just a single visionary who doesn't know how to find the right partners? I don't think so.
Yeah, very few. I wonder if there's, that's a great takeaway, right? If you're a visionary, you need to find, people who complement your skill set to actually make the execution happen, right? So it's not just hallucination; it actually is implemented vision, right? I'm wondering if there are other takeaways that you might point to in this book for Silicon Valley, apart from the just fascinating, history.
Yeah. First of all, make it personal and make it, connect humanities to technology. That's the lesson from the very first person in the book, who's Ada Lovelace, Lord Byron's daughter, all the way to the end of the book, which is people talk about the singularity. They talk about artificial intelligence. They say it's 20 years away. It's always 20 years away. But what actually succeeds is people say, let me put it on your wrist, or let me make it on your lap, or on a tablet, or on a phone, so you can carry it with you.
Right, take it to the woods.
The real lesson is make it simple, make it user-friendly interfaces that are intuitive, and make it incredibly personal, because it's about connecting humans to technology, not divorcing humans and technology.
Now, you mentioned Ada Lovelace, and I'd love to ask about that, because women figure fairly large in the beginning of your book with, Lovelace, who worked with Babbage on, concepts or actual programs, right, for programming this analytical machine that he was trying to make. And then women were heavily involved in computer programming during the war years in the early 50s, but they sort of disappear from the story in the second half. What happened? Where'd the women go?
I think women have not felt as welcome in technology. They've not had as many role models because history doesn't record the women programmers of ENIAC or Grace Hopper or Ada Lovelace as well as I think they deserve to be chronicled. And I think it's it's not been as inclusive of women and, for that matter, other people. And I think that's a problem that the tech industry is now starting to address. But women in particular were great mathematicians. More women got PhDs in math in the 1930s than 20, 30 years later. I mean, just in absolute number and in proportion.
Wow.
And likewise, more women were studying computer science 20 years ago than are studying computer science at universities today. I think I read in Nick Bilton's piece that like 0.4% of women now major in computer science at universities.
Yeah.
That's ridiculous. You don't want to cut out half the population from being creative in the world of computer science.
Well, early on, I mean, women were programmers because the programming was viewed as sort of the less glamorous part, right? So they did.
Right. Boys with their toys thought the hardware was the glamorous thing, and making a big old machine like ENIAC was great. And they thought that reprogramming it, which meant understanding exactly how the circuits work, so you could plug and unplug the cables and do the switches, so that the program that was doing missile trajectories could do something like atom bomb explosions. They thought that was a little bit women's work, and there were a lot of women mathematicians doing it. It turned out, of course, that the hardware sort of became a commodity, interchangeable. You didn't care whether you're using a UNIVAC or Sperry Rand or a Honeywell computer.
Right.
It was COBOL, the programming language that Grace Hopper and some of her friends helped create. It was those type of software languages that actually become more important in the digital age.
Yeah, I was just going to say, with the advent of the internet, that's sort of must have switched that perception permanently, I would think.
Right. And I think that the internet is a very empowering technology. It was done peer-to-peer in the way it was developed, and so that's sort of ingrained into the genetic code of the internet, is that it's a peer-to-peer process, not something handed down by authority, a top-down process. And a lot of women who were programming in the 50s were very good at open source programming. You know, they would all share their programming and their subroutines and subroutine libraries, and it was very good. And I suspect that in 10 years, you know, there'll be a lot more women in technology.
That sort of open source thread is another one that I was really interested in. There's a a great story about Bill Gates and the Homebrew Computer Club and the dispute that they had. I don't know. Can you tell us that story? Because I think that really is a classic illustration of that sort of proprietary versus open source.
Bill Gates sees the Altair machine on the cover of Popular Electronics, famously drops out of Harvard, goes to Albuquerque, writes BASIC for it, and then when the Homebrew Computer Club has a visit of the first Altair, people take the paper tape that has Microsoft, he just named his company that, he and Paul Allen, BASIC, and they start copying, and he writes this letter saying, hey, you're stealing, this is theft, we're supposed to get paid for software. And so what you have is really two strands.
They're a bunch of hippies, right? The Homebrew Computer Club is like...
Well, there are some phone freaks and some hackers and some hippies.
Yeah.
And some community organizers as well as electronic geeks and people who worked in the defense industry. It was that wonderful amalgam of people you have out here in the Bay Area, especially in the 1970s, and they were all somewhat resistant to authority, slightly rebellious. It was the one theme that ran through the anti-war protesters to the hippies to the communal, people who read the Whole Earth catalog once too often. But they really formed this group, and they decide, hey, let's liberate the software. And the good thing is, from then on, you have two strands. You have the proprietary strand, which includes Apple, because at that Homebrew Computer Club, there's Wozniak. And he's looking at the specs for the Intel 8088, the microprocessor, and he says, oh, I can make a circuit board that's even cooler than the Altair, and I can put a monitor and a keyboard, and he starts handing it out to people at the Homebrew Computer Club. But his friend from down the street, Steve Jobs, says, wait a minute, let's go to my garage and make these and sell them. And Steve, very famously, is very much of a controlling closed software, connecting software to hardware. And, both models contribute. In fact, both models being in competition with each other, having Apple and a Microsoft operating system, but then Linux and GNU Linux, and then Android, but also having iOS mobile operating system. Some are closed, some are open, but they spur each other on.
Kind of works together.
Do you think that walled gardens and proprietary business models are a projection of the male persona?
I don't know if it's a projection of the male persona. It's certainly a projection of Steve's persona, Steve Jobs, because he was controlling. He was a perfectionist. He would say, Picasso wouldn't let somebody mess on his canvas. Therefore, Steve Jobs believed in being in a walled garden.
Uh-huh.
And you know what? There's something nice about it.
Yeah.
When I got my first iPod, and it just automatically synced with the iTunes software and the iTunes store, that was a heck of a lot better than the gunky MP3 players in which the hardware and the software weren't integrated.
Absolutely.
So the tightly integrated model is like being in a Zen garden that Steve Jobs loved so much. There's something, kind of nice about being in the hands of a control freak. But then also you become to appreciate how an open system, like, more Android system or Linux, allows more creativity. So I think it's a projection of a personality. Richard Stallman, who creates GNU Linux and, the Linux operating system, that's open sourced and free, that's a projection of his personality as much as the iOS is a projection of Steve Jobs' personality.
Very much so, yeah. Stallman is a pretty unique character.
So was Steve Jobs.
Yeah. So there's one more thing I want to ask you about, which is sort of the involvement of government, obviously figured really large in the early days of both computing and the internet. And there was a sort of triangle of government and private industry and academic research that you talk about Vannevar Bush being instrumental in setting up. But it seems like government spending on R&D is much less now. Is that triangle falling apart? Is that going to hurt our competitiveness or our ability to innovate?
It's a really, really good question, and I fear the answer is yes. There was, as you said, the Vannevar Bush triangle, in which whether it was the internet or the first computers or even things like getting the microchips into the nose cones of the guidance systems computers for the space program.
Which helped create a market for them, right?
Yeah, you would not have had the microchip market the way it was if you didn't have government, academia, and private industry working together, and even places like RAND and SRI and, Bell Labs, with that matter, Lincoln Labs and BBN, that were sort of hybrids of government contractors, private industry, and academics. And we did the basic research. And Vannevar Bush, who you mentioned, said that's the seed corn for future invention. Nowadays, we're decimating basic research. We don't, Google does it fine, but we don't have Bell Labs or Xerox PARC the way they used to be. We don't have National Science Foundation funding as reliable as it used to be. And then every day we wake up and there's an Ebola virus, and you might think, what were we doing 2 or 3 years ago when there was a sequester that cut off funding for genetic engineering on viruses that would have been the basic research that we would want to have as our foundation these days?
That's a very good point. It's such a tough sell in today's political climate, this idea that we need to spend more on science that's not necessarily going to have an immediate payoff.
It's hard to sell for partisan political reasons, but the person who did it the best was Dwight Eisenhower. When you're talking about the creation of ARPA, the creation of the space program, and of course infrastructure like the interstate highways, Eisenhower always said, I love my scientists. He had Killian and he had these people around him, and he knew because they had won World War II, not based just on manpower, but on computing power and missile trajectory power and radar and everything else that got invented then, including the seeds for the first computers. And so I don't think it has to be partisan, and I do think it would help if here in Silicon Valley and San Francisco, people could have, their belief in individualism, but still say we need to tackle certain problems in a collaborative way, having government, universities. You look at Stanford, it really depends on government. Larry Page and Sergey Brin came to Stanford as graduate students based on government-funded programs at Stanford.
Right.
They would not have necessarily been there if the government weren't funding research at Stanford University. You don't want to blow that.
Right. Yeah, that's a really good lesson. Well, we may be nearly out of time here, so I just want to thank you for spending some time in what...
Well, I got kind of passionate because you asked all the good questions.
Well, I know you've had a very busy book tour schedule. I wish you the best of luck. I hope it does very well. And thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us, Walter.
It was really fun. Thanks. Bye.
Thanks, Walter.
Well, that's another episode of What to Think, VentureBeat's Technology News Podcast. Thank you very much for spending your time with us. As always, you can find us online at VentureBeat.com. And if you haven't yet subscribed to our podcast in iTunes, what are you thinking? Just search for What to Think on iTunes. We'll see you there. We'll catch you next week. Until then, I'm Dylan Tweeney.
And I'm Mark Sullivan.
Catch you later.